Your new magazine came today.
Why didn't you tell me that before?
I'm sorry, I
Honey,
forgot.
I have asked you time and time again. Please, please, please let me know when the mail comes.
Frank, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Well, if there's something important in it, maybe I should be taking care of it before dinner instead of after.
I'm sorry, I forgot.
How many times do I have to ask you this? I mean, I don't put that much on you. I don't ask you to do that much for me.
Well, I thought we could have a nice dinner together.
Each of us is motivated by different things. We discovered this the last time. Certain consequences important to me may hold no interest at all for you. Of course, things like money and success are of interest to most people because they can be traded for many of the consequences we as individuals want. Many of them, but not all. That's why when we talk about keeping someone going through a program, keeping someone moving toward his or her goals, we cannot know what consequences are important to a specific person. The program that we design must be tied at as many points as possible to the critical consequences for the given person. We must then have some way to identify the consequences which motivate ourselves and others. In our last program, we examined some very basic procedures we can follow. In the upcoming example, both these procedures are used. See if you can identify them. The case involves the woman whom Dr. Goldiamond spoke of last program. Remember, she had some difficulties with her child. It turns out that she also mentioned a problem with her husband.
He was not our client. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't come in. So we contracted with her to teach her a constructional approach to dealing with her husband.
If you want to, but don't have it on too loud.
Again, she saw only the bad side of things. That is, the pathology which she wanted eliminated.
Your new magazine came today.
Why didn't you tell me that before?
I'm sorry, I
Honey,
forgot.
I have asked you time and time again. Please, please, please let me know when the mail comes.
Frank, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Well, if there's something important in it, maybe I should be taking care of it before dinner instead of after.
I'm sorry, I forgot.
How many times do I have to ask you this? I mean, I don't put that much on you. I don't ask you to do that much for me.
When they were first married, he had shared the dishes with her and had worked together with her in numerous other ways. But things had now reached such a point that immediately after supper, he ignored her, went to his den to examine his slides and photography books, and left her with the dishes and the rest of the house.
Irene,
Yes?
where did you say you put the new magazine?
In the drawer, Frank.
Irene, it's not in here. Could you please come down and show me where you put it?
All right, 1 minute.
Now!
Okay. There.
Well, no wonder I couldn't find
That's
it. You
where
put
it
it under a
always
piece
is,
of paper in there. Look, I don't know how many times I have to ask you. Could you please try to keep this den for me clean so I have someplace nice to come home to? Look at this. Was Billy down here? I really don't want him in here.
Okay, I'll tell
And
him
look
to
at
stay
all
out.
this junk over here and up in here.
Okay, Frank, are you done?
Yeah. I want to show you something here.
Look, I really don't
But
have the
I-
time.
It looks like he has very little use for her and very much prefers the company of his magazines and slides to her company. Maybe he wants to show them off, but that's as far as it goes. I asked her to examine this scene more closely.
How was your dinner?
Mm-hmm.
Did you do anything at work today?
I said, I'm candid camera, and I snap 2 pictures in rapid succession. The first
Honey,
shows
why
him
don't you come on down
screaming
to the den and let me
about
show
the
you how this
state
works. I'd like
of
to take
his
a couple-
study. What does the second picture show? Me running down the stairs, she said. If it's not one thing, it's another.
Irene, where is my pipe?
This occurs almost every single night of the week. I said, well, if this occurs repeatedly, if this kind of relation goes on, then maybe your coming down the stairs is what maintains his screaming. She thought for a moment and asked, well, why would he want me downstairs with him? And I commented, well, maybe he's proud of his collection. Maybe he'd like to share it with you. Maybe he'd like to show off all these things to his wife. And she said, well, she said, if that's what he wants, why doesn't he ask for it in a nicer way? Well, what happens if he asks you in a nice way? And she said, well, I've got to do the dishes then. He certainly doesn't help me on the dishes. So I said, well, inasmuch as he's going to get you coming down the stairs anyway, why don't you come down on your own and let him have what you're both after, namely friendly relations between you, and maybe then if we can turn things around in this area, maybe things will start getting turned around upstairs as well with the dishes. A situation which she had interpreted as displaying his hostility and thorough non-use for her was one which could be interpreted as indicating that he needed her very badly and wanted her.
How's work today?
Well, it was fine. It was fine.
Good. Oh, what's this about?
Oh, I have one of these down in the den.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I've asked you to see it. Would you like to see it?
Yeah, I'd really like to.
Well, okay. Let's go down and look.
Okay.
Well, what about the dishes?
They can wait.
I asked her how it went, and she said it was like a hot knife going through butter. And you know, she said there's something funny about it. I actually enjoyed looking at those slides. You know, he's a darn good photographer.
Did you single out the procedures? Name 2 important consequences for the husband. One procedure was discussed last program. What does the husband like to do? How does he spend his free time? That's right, his hobby is photography. At times, photography is more important to him than his dinner or his family. The second procedure, as we learned before, is to observe what follows immediately the behavior in question. In this example, the behavior in question has the husband screaming at his wife from the den. What follows upon this? She runs to the den. The consequence, her presence and attention. By giving him her attention immediately after dinner, she avoids the yelling, and by the way, gets some help with her housework, something important to her. This is an example of a program systematically applied that gets what she wants. Her husband also gets what he wants in the bargain. We'll be learning more about how to design programs in the next show. But first, Dr. Goldiamond suggests some more procedures for identifying our critical consequences.
Another way we have about finding out the consequences which will maintain a person's behavior or which will keep him going through the program is to just ask ourselves or to try to find out for ourselves what is it that we know about the group of which the person is a part, or what do we know about his individual history or her individual history, which can then help us find out what is important for the particular person.
Well, give me an example.
Well, I'll just take my own personal case. When I was in the hospital, ultimately I wound up in the wheelchair that I'm in right now. When I came there, it was known that The particular person who was there was a psychologist. It's a group who is quite enthusiastic about what he's doing, has published widely in the area, and the like. And so here is now a history about this particular person in the group that could have been capitalized upon, because the aim is to get you going again.
Mm-hmm.
However, a mistake was made in the best-run institutions. Mistakes can be made. The mistake was made, I was told afterwards, that, gee, we decided that, gee, you're here, we could use you very much, but we don't want to confuse roles. We don't want you functioning professionally at the same time that you're a patient. You know, I was never asked.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, so we want you to be a nice little patient and not to function professionally. Well, they ought to have known me better. They knew about me, and so do the rest of the staff, and some of the patients as well. So I began to get all kinds of people coming to me, including staff, for professional advice, how to set up programs, how to do things of this kind, and which anybody who had known my history would have predicted. This is exactly what is going to happen.
What you would do.
That's right. You know, like, how could he do otherwise? Now, they could have harnessed this into a program.
Mm-hmm.
As it is, I harnessed it into a program of my own. So I enjoy, you know, doing what we're now talking about. You know, this whole program, I enjoy the topics of it. And so I also did it in the hospital. You know, why not? The thing to do is to make it part of a program.
Well, I'm sure that you must have run into this while you were in the hospital. What about all those people who don't have the knowledge that you have as a psychologist, and who also, for whatever reason, don't have that impetus? There are some people that do not want to get better. Mm-hmm. Their motivation is to do nothing, is to lie back, to remain in the hospital, even perhaps do things to keep them in the hospital. Now, looking at that superficially, that would seem very peculiar, especially for someone like yourself, who is very motivated in the opposite direction. But why is that? Why, and what are the reasons for people who don't seem to want to get better?
Mm-hmm. Which then brings us to another way of examining consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here is somebody who doesn't seem to want to get better. See, I don't believe that people are that different. See, I think he should want to get better. As a matter of fact, the whole staff believes he should want to get better, and they keep urging him, but you should want to do this, you know? How come he isn't motivated? And this, that, and the other thing. And this is where this whole motivation business gets you into trouble. In that particular case, we might use the other procedure that I talked about, finding out the consequences.
Yeah.
We ask ourselves, what are the alternatives to what is going on right now? Let me give you an example. Okay, I was hospitalized. I had a career to go back to, professional life I wanted to resume. The University of Chicago wanted me back, made no bones about it and the like. Supposing they had said, you know, to hell with you, we can't use you anymore. You know, what then would have happened? I don't know, but they never did this. And so there I was, I had something to look forward to. And what I had to look forward to was what I had been doing. Now it was deferred, and I had to do it under different circumstances. So I tried to figure out, you know, what these are and how to get them. But there were some people, there was nothing outside, nothing available for them. I happened to think of a particular young man. He was a late teenager in one of the slum areas. His parents were gone. His family was not around anymore. He simply had been living with a kind of a gang, had gotten shot. And now if he was discharged, he'd be released by himself, maybe sitting in a wheelchair in a one-room apartment, which welfare might get for him. Mm-hmm. What would he do?
So
what
no
sort of living is this?
No family ties, no education, not even the solace of returning to the gang, because
That's right.
they would not take him back.
Nothing to look forward to. On the other hand, the alternative for him, in this case, one alternative is pretty bleak. The alternative of staying in the hospital, where there are lots of people his age, older people, and you're part of a community, you know, moving back and forth, doing all kinds of things, that's it. But in order to be there, you've sort of got to be pretty sick. So he didn't participate in the activities on PT. He didn't do any of these things. That's physical therapy.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't do any of the things which one is supposed to do to get better. And the staff then decided, gee, we can't work with him anymore. We're going to try to get rid of him, send him off somewhere else, because we can't help him. He doesn't want to get better. We can't help him. So what he then did was to lie on his side in such a manner that he developed a bed sore. The technical term is decubitus ulcer. They had to keep him.
Mm-hmm.
Every effort they then made to discharge him, he knew the system.
Because they were giving him nothing to go to.
That's right.
In the hospital, he felt average. He was a part of the group.
Well, more than average, he was a kind of leader. He just went around, you know, he's alive. He's alive.
He would have been the freak, the lonely freak, who is so different, the way he was thinking, so different from everyone else around him.
See, I don't know how he was thinking. All I know he'd have sort of nothing going for him on the outside. And all I just do is put myself in his boots. How would I just like to sit looking outside a window, maybe, you know, and that's that. You don't have to be a kind of freak about this, but just, you know, what is there worth living for? You know, you call this living? And so in his case, the alternative, the hospital did all kinds of things, and every effort the hospital staff made to discharge him, well, then he escalated his sickness to keep himself in there.
They just seem to have missed the point that when they got him well enough to get him out, they had to give him something to go home to.
Yeah, well, the thing to do for him, of course, would have been to develop some kind of program for him.
So, now we've added 2 more procedures to our arsenal. We may want to use them to identify important consequences. We also found out a little more about programming. For example, don't take away the important consequence. Rather, provide a new way in which to get it. Removing the consequence without providing an alternative way to get it usually results in increasing the unwanted behavior rather than eliminating it. But we're talking about 2 new ways to identify the consequence. One question to ask is, what do we know about the person and the groups of which he is a part? What does he like to do? This method is not foolproof, but it does suggest the direction our investigation should take. Be careful, though, because what we are using here is a guess based on a generalization, which is not always accurate. Some psychologists may really prefer not to see people with problems. Looking at the alternatives available to the person is an important way to identify what's going on, especially in cases which seem to make no sense. What would he or she be doing were it not for the current situation? In this way, we identify consequences to be avoided and can design a program with these in mind. We now have 4 ways to keep in mind when talking about motivating someone. For the record, here are 2 more. Dr. Goldiamond, are there any other procedures that we can talk about?
Well, one of them, of course, is the experimental laboratory, where we set up the conditions to try to find out what the critical consequences are. But of course, the particular procedures are not of very much concern to us right now. We can use that laboratory to find out what they are, but certainly we don't want to become laboratory scientists right now. But one of the things that the laboratory teaches us is how to observe, and we can use those observations to develop procedures outside the laboratory, which is one of the things that I, of course, have been doing all along.
Well, we've talked about the groups, we've talked about the history, we've talked about the laboratory evidence, but I think we've left out something pretty basic. Ask the person.
Oh, that's an excellent point. It is indeed. During the Great Depression, stressing great.
Not the current, just the great.
Current, just the great one. In the 30s, the federal government had a program to resettle farmers who had lost their farms in Alaska. And some of them stuck it out and some of them didn't. And what they discovered was, you know, they asked themselves the question of what is it that was involved. It turns out they had given them a questionnaire when the farmers first enrolled in the program. And there was one question there which was highly indicative of whether they'd make it or whether they wouldn't make it, and that was the answer to the question of, would you like to settle in Alaska? You know, they might have listened to them and saved themselves a lot of problem. The people who said yes, they would, tended to stick it out, and the people who said no, didn't. Now, you can't always tell. You know, it's not always that simple, because people can lie, they can, you know, fudge things. Furthermore, they themselves may not often know what it is that they are after. But people will tell you, you're right. One way to get them to tell you is by asking. But then there is another way. They're always telling, as I said. And that's by stop, you know, look, listen, observing them very carefully, their backgrounds, the situation in which they are. And it often turns out they told us in this manner, in the very beginning, what the critical consequences are.
Well, that makes sense. They don't always know. None of us always know. But a lot of times we feel, and that may not be a quote, a justified, quote unquote, reasonable, coherent, but it's personal, it's heart, it's gut, and it makes sense to listen.
Yeah. Well, people make sense if you listen in the right way. And one of the ways to listen and to look is to examine the consequences which seem to occur after their behaviors. Another way, of course, is to look at the behaviors themselves. Another way is to look at the history, you know. They do make sense. But the way to find out what the critical consequences are is to stop and look and listen appropriately.
As Dr. Goldiamond said, the laboratory is only of passing interest to us, but it may be useful in future shows as a way of demonstrating certain things. The last way to identify consequences is important, as much for its uses as for the caution which should be exercised in using it. Asking yourself or others what consequences are important may give you very valuable information, but it may also give you unreliable answers. Watching what goes on, and in so doing using the observable procedures discussed earlier, will give you a more accurate reading than asking. Certainly asking can give you a place to start, but if it doesn't make sense, observe the behavior. That will make sense when the observations are made according to the earlier procedures. Throughout these discussions, we've been talking about individuals. But every day, individuals must deal with groups and institutions. What I want to know is, can the same procedures be applied to the institutions as well as to the individuals? We've been talking about individuals, Dr. Goldiamond, and I'll admit you've convinced me that people make sense if you listen and observe. However, you're going to have a heck of a time convincing me that the idea of consequences also applies to groups and institutions. I really find it difficult to believe in this day and age that many of them make sense.
Yes.
I see you choked on that one, too.
Yes, I did. I think institutions make sense as well. What we have to start looking at is the consequences and all the other variables that we were looking at with regard to individuals, the consequences, their history, the particular patterns or institutional practices they're engaged in, and the like, and start to ask, how do these make sense?
Do you mean widen the lens, but still looking at it from all the angles?
Our unit of study is now the institution, rather than the individual. The unit of study is what we call an institution. Let's take an example. There was a recent study about elderly, wheelchair-ridden patients who just moved around in their wheelchairs. And the staff felt that, you know, they should stay there. You know, they're too sick to get up and move around. On the other hand, there were some bright young people there who said, well, gee, maybe we can get them going and get them moving, then of course this is going to save them in a variety of ways. Their bones won't change as rapidly as they're doing right now. Osteoporosis will be retarded. A variety of beneficial changes will occur if they start to walk rather than being in the wheelchair. But it was institutionalized practice to keep them in wheelchairs. Well, what they did to demonstrate to the hospital staff that the patients could walk is they set up a program whereby they asked the patient to stand up and, walk a little bit and stand in front. And when the person was walking, they engaged them in social conversation and chit-chat and so forth and so on. And soon they were getting people to walk goodly distances by themselves and not use the wheelchairs. They published this with pride, and they'd see that naughty institution. What they've done is they've set up what is called, quote, the aged sick role, that if you're old, you're sick as well, and just put you down in the wheelchair. And this is bad, bad, bad. However, it turns out that the aged sick role, what that does is it sort of rationalizes certain financial consequences for the institution. Because if some of the elderly get up and do walk around, granted that their osteoporosis may be retarded, they can slip and fall and break a hip, do things of this kind, and then there are all kinds of consequences for the institution in terms of the extra care they have to take, in terms of the extra costs, in terms of the possibility of the family finding out, being accused of being neglect, and so forth and so on. In this particular case, the institutional consequences, finance and more work and more effort towards helping people be healthy because of the fact that the consequences attached to that are not of the same kind of payoff nature as the consequences of simply putting them in a wheelchair, then they engage in the latter.
Well, it's also true that, in fact, at this moment, the United States Congress is investigating nursing homes and the type of financial assistance they get from federal, state, and local governments to, in effect, have people sit down and not move and be tranquilized because they're less trouble. They don't have to take care of them as much when they're tranquilized.
That's right.
This is far more commonplace, we're finding out, than any of us had any idea.
That's right.
But besides a congressional investigation, and many of these investigations go on, and yet the conditions don't seem to improve, how do we get around the type of system that maintains the illness, that refuses to, in effect, stick its neck out in any way to get the health back? How do we do it?
Well, we have to approach the institution that, quote, doesn't seem to want to get better.
Like the individual.
Like the individual who, quote, doesn't seem to want to get better. What are the alternatives for the institution? What consequences are governing its behavior? And can we now start attention to the consequences in the other way? And can we turn it around, as in all the individual cases that we've talked about?
So institutions are affected by consequences as well. Their behavior, which may seem illogical at first, makes sense when we look at the consequences for those places. The consequences may be financial, or legal, or something else. But if we look closely enough and apply some of the procedures we have learned for identifying these consequences, the institutions make sense too. By now, we should all be able to answer three parts of the question, where do we go from here? What is our goal, and where are we now in relation to it? Remember that where we are now is in terms of our strength. By identifying important consequences, we can decide what to use in keeping ourselves, or others, going through a program. Next time, we'll see how consequences help us make sense of emotions and strange or odd behavior.